If you take a closer look at this painting, you may notice that there are three very different watercolor techniques that I used throughout. Slow glazing of multiple color layers on the lemons creates a glowing light effect, an illusion of three-dimensional shape on paper. The leaves, on the other hand, are done using the most simple, very beginner-friendly technique, so-called watercolor blooms, which is essentially random drops of water that I add right before the paint is dry. And the tiny elongated strokes on the feathers I painted using wet on dry watercolor technique, similar to how you would use a pencil with very little water. Each method of applying the paint creates a unique effect, so the composition as a whole, despite having a rather limited color palette, can have a whole range of different textures and finishes. And in this video, I will demonstrate each watercolor technique so you can understand the full process, learn more about what your paints and brushes are capable of, and how you can enhance your artwork by playing with different effects. As always, the references I used to create this composition are listed in the video description below, along with a full list of my watercolor materials. And if you're following me on Patreon, thank you for your support. You can join me as I paint this bird and the lemons in real time. This is our March tutorial, and you will find the outline and step-by-step photos on my Patreon channel. I'm going to start by showing you the glazing technique that I used on the sunbird and the lemons. It's the most time-consuming technique, but it's also the one that creates the most realistic results. It requires applying very thin, very watered-down layers of watercolor, letting each layer dry out completely before applying the next. I will start with the lightest yellow on the bird and the lemons, adding a tiny bit of green and violet wet into wet, meaning before my paper is completely dry. I'm lightly marking up the key areas of light and shadow that we will enhance with shadows and additional layers later on. The first layer is always our map of color, and it's important to keep it light, leaving a few patches of dry paper. These areas will remain bright white and will serve as true white highlights because there's no white paint in traditional watercolor medium. Once the first layer is completely dry, we can add some shadows using a slightly darker, more saturated pigments. I decided to mix in perylene violet with my cadmium yellow. It creates a nice warm brown, and notice that it's also the same color scheme that I will be using on the bird. So there's a nice continuity in my palette and everything will look very cohesive in the end. We can also add more green and even some saturated orange. Notice that there are two types of shadows I'm painting on the lemon. The cast shadow falling from the top lemon onto the bottom one, it's quite smooth, and the so-called attached shadow at the bottom half, which is quite bumpy around the edges. The surface of the lemon is a little bit rough, so I'm going to try and capture that with the tip of my brush. Similarly, I will glaze a second layer of color on the bird, starting with the rich brown violet, and once again I'm using perylene violet from Daniel Smith. You can add some oranges and even purples, and then a layer of warm green on the belly. As you can see, only after 2 or 3 layers of color, we have some nice depth and dimension on the bird and the fruit. And now I can show you the second technique. This is super easy, and even if you're just starting to learn watercolor medium, you can incorporate this into your work right away. This is called watercolor blooms, and it's the simplest way to create beautiful texture on paper. All you need to do is cover a small section of your painting with watercolor. I'm using a variety of greens, but you can limit yourself to just one green. And right after you finish putting down the paint, add a few drops of clear water with the tip of your brush. The water will push the particles of paint out, creating what's called a bloom. These are a little bit unpredictable, but always beautiful and a great way to create some visually interesting background greenery without getting too lost in the details. I have a full tutorial on my YouTube channel on how to paint green leaves, both using this quick and easy blooming technique and more intricate glazing technique, so you can check it out afterwards. I will leave a link in the video description below. Lastly, I'm going to add some wet on dry details on the bird to really highlight the lovely feathers, make some of those details stand out even more. After all, the sunbird is the focus of the painting, so it deserves some special attention. My paper is completely dry. My paint is quite saturated, not watery at all, so every stroke I put down looks very sharp. It doesn't blend and remains in place, so I can really mimic the direction and positioning of each small feather that I see in the reference photo. Notice that I'm not using any new pigments at this point, simply applying very saturated paint with the tip of my brush, using very deliberate short strokes. Unlike those very big washes of color in the beginning, this is more like drawing with a sharp pencil or pen, so every stroke is visible even after it's dry. And that's how watercolor painting usually goes, from light, watery layers to smaller, much more saturated, darker details. In the last few minutes of the painting, I usually add the smallest, darkest shadows, tiny bits of extra texture and detail, like a few leaf veins and maybe smaller, dark spots on the lemon, just to add more visual interest closer to the bird. Let's not forget the legs. I will use the same wet on dry technique, adding some dark strokes on the shadow side. I also glazed another layer of vibrant yellows all over the most important parts, like the bird and the lemons. The most magical thing about watercolors is that we can continue glazing transparent colors over and over as long as the surface underneath is dry, and we can adjust the colors and the vibrancy even after the main parts are finished. In fact, I would say that it's much easier to do this color balancing work towards the end when we can easily see all the main blocks of color working together, which means you don't need to constantly judge your work throughout, especially not in the early stages when it's easy to get frustrated when something doesn't look quite right. My advice is to trust the process and wait until the end to make the final call on how your colors and shadows have landed. So wait until the end, and you can always reassess the full composition and make sure all your values, meaning lights and darks, are working in harmony. Sometimes at this stage, I also realize that something is maybe missing, which is exactly what happened here. I felt like the color palette was too monotonous, and I decided to add, you're not going to believe this, but I've added a little bit of turquoise in the background for the leaves. You may think this is an overkill, and it's purely subjective, of course, but I thought it was a perfect complement to the bright yellows. I'm also thinking of adding a bee or a butterfly on top, but I will actually let you guys decide if this makes any sense. Let me know if you think I should add a bee or another insect in the comments below. Once again, the full tutorial for this composition is on my Patreon channel. Like, share, and subscribe if you enjoy the content. Thank you for watching and painting with me, and I will see you next week with a new tutorial.